area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Shall I just start?
Yeah, just
okay. Hi, my name's Sharon Davies. I'm an anthropologist and I have been learning about Indonesia since I started studying the language in 1994. So quite a long time. My current research focuses on climate change, and I'm particularly interested in how women, older people, people with disabilities are really impacted by climate change. And so a lot of our research has been in eastern Indonesia looking at the impacts of that. But before the climate change research, I've always been really interested just in gender and sexuality in Indonesia. So what Australia can learn from Indonesia, what Indonesia can learn from Australia, and opening up that conversation.
Shall we use like sexuality education in terminology instead of sex education?
So sex education, even in Australia and everywhere, I think is still slightly taboo. And in a lot of schools across the world, wherever you are, it often gets rendered down into just a functional education about reproductive health. So how babies are made, how babies should be brought up, maybe any sexually transmitted diseases, but it's very limited to just functional education, and that's why it's called sex education. Sexuality education is a much more broader term, and I think if we can open ourselves to that conversation, then we can open up a conversation about things like consent. So how do you talk to someone about consent to have sex? And that's particularly tricky in Indonesia, where having sex before marriage is really taboo and not just considered immoral, but it's soon to be a criminal offence. And so how can you have a conversation about consent if you're not married? But the assumption also is that if you are married, you don't need to talk about consent because a husband and wife, and this is what a husband does, and the wife should just submit. So even then, I think it's really important to have education around sexuality, and it can be done in a way that's culturally and religiously sensitive. So it clearly isn't advocating free sex. So just by talking about sex isn't going to encourage people to go out and just have sex. What it actually does is gives people the tools and the control to decide when they want to have sex, how they want to have sex. It gives them a language to talk about asking for consent and permission. And it also makes it easier for people, particularly women, if there's been sexual violence, then they can report that. So sexuality education is also about opening conversations about if there's been a sexual assault, where can I go? Who do I talk to? So it's breaking down some of that shame, some of that taboo, not so people just go and have sex with anybody. Actually, what it does is just give people more control over their own bodies and a way then to seek recourse if something happens.
Females, and at what age it should start it actually?
So both my husband and I are very open about sex and about gender and about sexuality, and my kids will be very embarrassed about this, but our approach was to talk about sex from the day they were born, and so to try and create a space where it wasn't a taboo topic. And it is still quite embarrassing. My kids are like, oh, don't talk about sex. But hopefully they're a little more comfortable about talking about that now, because we've had that conversation since they were little. And again, this will be very controversial in lots of places, but we've had condoms in our house since the kids were born. And we got them to play with condoms and make them into balloons. So they're really grossed out by that now. I'm like, whoa, their condoms are gross. But what it does is it actually gives them then a vocabulary. It kind of, even though they're still all grossed out by it, it at least has opened a conversation where, condoms are something, if you're going to have sex, you need to do it safely, and this is what a condom is for. So I think your question of when to start talking about sex, for me, straight away. Like, this is how we demystify it. This is how we break down taboos. This is how we give everybody a sense of control and safety over their bodies. And we can protect people much more if people have a language to speak about sex and sexuality, if they know who they can talk to about that in a safe way. So I would really encourage open conversations from the earliest time, so that those conversations just start. And then this really helps as kids get older, that if they have a problem or an issue, they have someone safe to talk about that. So I would really encourage that from a young age. And of course, it doesn't have to be the same message everywhere. Think about how it might be done in a culturally sensitive way, in a religiously sensitive way. And again, I think a lot of people worry that if you talk about sex, or if you give condoms and have them in your bathroom, that kids are just like, oh, well, there's a condom, I should go and have sex now. But that is not what happens. They have then a choice that if they're going to do that anyway, then they have an option for a safe sex experience. But that doesn't make anybody go out and do something they're not going to do anyway. It just gives them the tools to be a bit safer about that.
That's important, but in culturally, like, people not really accepted it to talk about.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to find culturally and religiously sensitive ways to approach this. And I find one way to do that is to put things aside so you can look down and see what the fear is. So if people aren't talking about sex, why is that? What's the fear that people have that if we start talking about sex, what's going to happen? And the fear seems to be, if we talk about having sex, the kids are just going to go off and have sex. So part of it is saying, actually, that's not going to happen. If you look at countries that are very progressive about sex education, they have much lower rates of unwanted pregnancy. They have much lower rates of domestic and sexual violence, because children are taught ways of dealing with that. So I think then, to make it culturally and religiously specific, we first figure out what the fear is. And I think a lot of times it is that people are just going to have sex outside of marriage. So reassuring people that isn't what's going to happen. What we want is, even within marriage, that people have healthy sexual lives. And part of that, even within marriage, is about consent. So consent should still be negotiated within a marriage. So we can, at schools, start talking about that. Even if it's prefaced by, when you get married, this is what a good marital sex life looks like. We can do it through that lens. So once you're married, consent is still an issue. And this is how you can negotiate consent. Once you're married, people still get STIs. You can still get HIV. And so marriage doesn't make you immune to that. Instead, you should still be having those conversations. So we can be teaching kids, once you get married, you still need to talk about safe sex. Like if someone is having sex outside of marriage, that needs to be a conversation. And the fastest growing rate of HIV in Indonesia is not amongst trans women, it's not amongst sex workers, it's not amongst intravenous drug users, it's amongst married women. And this is because their husbands are having unsafe sex and coming home to their wives. And no one has the tools to have that conversation. So if we look about the harm of not talking about sex education, then we see that in fast growing rates of HIV amongst married women. And how do we address that? We address that by teaching people how to talk about sex, how to negotiate consent, and we teach them about safe sex.
What do you think about the gender bias can contribute to unequal access to the sex education information?
Yeah, I think that's very true. So one of the questions is, where are people getting information about sex from? And I suspect in Indonesia, as elsewhere, men in particular are getting their information from porn sites, from the internet, and that is not a good way to get information about how to have safe sex, how to negotiate consent, or what even sex looks like. So if guys are getting their information from porn sites and from the internet, that is not a good place to get all of your information from. And I think there's nothing wrong with having information sessions for girls and for boys separately. My husband is a teacher at high school, and he attended yesterday, the day before, a sex ed session, and the girls went into this room and the boys went into that room. And so I think there's nothing wrong with separating out, dividing people so that they feel comfortable within their cohort. But it's important that everyone is getting full information. And so you don't want the girls to just learn about reproductive health. You want them to also learn about negotiating consent, about safe sex, and the same with the guys. Like, they also need to learn about negotiating consent, what consent looks like, what a good sex life looks like, and how to keep safe. So what are the sexual health measures that they can do? So the information should be equal, but finding out a way that people will receive that information in a way that they feel comfortable with is also important.
Towards the future, and then we can end with what is Monash Hervey? Like, what is the research center is about?
Yeah. Okay, great. So if we're thinking about sex ed in the future, what would that look like? And I think we can imagine that worldwide, like for every group, all religions, all cultures. What would good sex education and sexuality education look like? And I think what it would look like would be that people have an understanding, of reproductive health. We need to know, how babies are made and those kind of reproductive things. But they also need to know consent. How do you negotiate consent? How do you know that you have consent to do something? And I think actually also what a good sex life looks like is really important. Guys in particular, if all their information is coming from porn, that probably isn't what the average couple's sex life looks like. And so teaching girls and boys about a healthy and fulfilling sex life is really important. And I think all of that can be prefaced by alleviating the fear that by talking about sex or providing condoms that you're going to encourage people to just have free sex. Like, that is not the case. If people are given the tools to negotiate consent and have sex and to have sex when they want to, then that's what they will do. And people are choosing that as a time when they want to. And at the moment, people might be having sex without any of those tools. So I think that's what the future would look like, just open discussions that give people options and the ability to negotiate things. And I think here at the Herb Indonesian Engagement Centre that we have at Monash, one of our missions is really grounded in social justice. And so we're looking at ways in which the centre and its affiliates can really drive a future that looks much more equal in terms of everything with gender, but particularly in access to sexuality education, to ensure that people can live a free and fulfilled life with their partner, their married partner in Indonesia, if that's how it is framed, or however. And I think it's really important to think about the diversity of genders and sexualities and to really push forward that there's equality for everybody in that space.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you.
If anything you want to...
No, I think the